what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you have nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Welcome to another episode of the Seeds of Revolution, the Camas Books and Info Shop podcast. Camas is located on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen people, who are represented today by the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. My name's Will, and I'll be your host for an interview with award-winning Canadian author and Camas regular, Michael Christie, whose body of work includes the short story collection Beggar's Garden, his debut novel, If I Fall, If I Die, and the novel that's the subject of today's episode, Greenwood, a generational saga spanning from 1908 to 2038. Thank you so much for joining me today, Michael.
Thanks, Will. It's a pleasure to be here.
I really enjoyed the book, and I thought it would be great to get you on to talk about it, both because I think there's some elements of the book and themes that will be really interesting to Camas readers. Camas has also been growing our selection of new literary and speculative fiction, and we have your books on the shelves. And I really wanted to delve in. One of the things that I noticed right off the bat is this makes great radio, but on the text block, which is the part of the book where you flip the page opposite the spine, you've actually printed kind of a whirl of tree rings. And it makes this really interesting structure of the book where you start in 2038, which is during this time of huge climate collapse, and then work backward, 2008, 1974, 1938, and 1908, following this family backwards in time before moving forward back out. Did you have this structure in mind when you came up with the idea for Greenwood? How did that coalesce?
I did, yeah. I mean, I first of all should talk about the design of the actual physical book, which I'm very proud of and I love very much. And it was the work of a book designer at my publisher, McClellan & Stewart. Her name is Jennifer Griffiths. And we were all kind of riffing on ideas for the physical object. And one of us, I'm not sure if it was my editor or Jennifer, brought up this thing called 4-edge printing, which is like a kind of ancient bookmaking technique where, there are like books that have been painted, like there's like the gold effect thing on the end of the pages that I've always loved, but then there's also like books that have been printed on the end of the pages. So Jennifer looked into this and figured out how to do it by putting like a photo of the wood grain at the very extreme edge of the pages. And then when the book gets chopped, which is how they make books, I learned this in the process, it leaves like an image on the very outside edge of the text, and it's a wood grain effect. And she explained to me how she did it a bunch of times, and I still don't understand how it's actually done, but I'm so grateful that she figured it out, because I think it really adds to the reader's experience of, connecting the physicality of the book to the content, to the story, to the family tree, to the time periods that you discussed. So yeah, but the structure of the story itself is based on the rings of a tree. And that was an idea I had as I was writing the book. I had these characters who I knew were living in different times. All of them had something to do with forests or trees. There was a carpenter, there was like a timber tycoon, there was a sort of radical environmental activist character. And I, at some point, realized, oh, they're all members of the same family. And it wasn't until I was like cutting down a tree, actually, I'm a tree lover, but this particular tree had to go, and cut down the tree and looked at the stump and realized that this tree was kind of had its own story contained within its structure, and that the outer rings were the most recent, and then all the way to the center of the heartwood of the tree, or the core of the tree, was, its very beginnings. And I thought, wow, what a really beautiful way to try to tell a story. And so that's the shape that Greenwood took. And there is an index page that is like a cross section of a tree and shows sort of the narrative's journey from this future into the deep past and then back out to the future again. So it was a fun structure to play with, and sort of like an interesting way to tell the story.
Yeah, and I really like how that metaphor of the rings of the tree is reflected in the structure, as well as all of the symmetries through the narrative and the correspondences that come through. Part of the novel being set in 1938, you have
34. Sorry, 34.
1934.
Yeah.
You have the Dust Bowl.
Yes.
And in the 2038 section, you have this sort of advanced stage of ecological collapse, where you also have this ever-present dust that's choking people. And it's been spread through this event called the Withering.
Yes.
And where Jacinta, the opening character in the 2038 section,
Correct.
she is on an island off the coast of Vancouver Island,
Mm-hmm.
In a place, in like a tourist vacation spot run by a company called Holt Corp.
Mm-hmm.
And she's an overeducated, recent PhD grad,
Yeah.
struggling with debt. And she thinks she's been hired because her last name is Greenwood, and this island's called Greenwood Island.
Yes.
So there's this nice kind of correspondence there, no relation.
Yep.
And it's also called the Cathedral.
Yes.
And that
Forest Cathedral. Yeah.
and that kind of brought me to Cathedral Grove.
Of course it did.
On
absolutely.
Vancouver Island.
Yeah.
And something that I've noticed is a lot of folks have called this dystopian,
Mm-hmm.
where you have this kind of last holdout of old growth on this island in the Pacific Northwest. But it didn't feel that dystopian, which is partially why it took me a bit to get through that spot.
Yeah.
How did you kind of think up and imagine this kind of climate future?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the most chilling, at least for me, a person who loves nature and loves to be in nature and appreciates the like mental health and just joy benefits of having access to like old growth forest or ocean or just like natural splendor. One of the scary things about the climate disaster and climate change is that as those environments shrink or are degraded, who do you think is going to get access to those areas? I mean, and it's not going to be folks in my income bracket. And I think, like Naomi Klein described it as climate barbarism, this sense of like, as the world devolves, people are going to get more kind of protectionist and xenophobic. And you already see that with like immigration in Europe and all over the place. And so it's only, in my imaginative view, it's gonna get worse. And and this sort of idea of an enclave of like rich resort forest island only accessible by the rich was didn't really take that much imagination, unfortunately, because I kind of see things going there, and there's that, like, I went to Tofino this summer with my kids to go surfing, and it has that vibe already, and it only is sort of I was sort of extrapolating forward a little bit. So that it doesn't feel that dystopian, and I wanted it to be not so far in the future that it's like everything is destroyed and the whole, like this sort of almost like sci-fi version of dystopia. I wanted it to be a very uncomfortably relatable version of where things seem to be going, which they do seem to be going this direction to me.
Yeah, and I like how, the way that the reverence for forest has been commodified. I mean, the the rich folks who come out there are called pilgrims.
Yes.
So they kind of make it into this like spiritual experience, even though, you highlight the dissonance that's there. They're taking out their phones and doing selfies and kind of making it about themselves. And in addition to that, the cathedral, right? I think the pilgrims coming to the cathedral is very interesting. And one of the moments while I was reading about that, I was thinking there was a recent fad of like forest bathing.
Yeah. Oh, there is. Yeah.
And that kind of came out around the same time that this book did. So there's definitely, tapped into that zeitgeist.
Yeah. And certainly like, people who are maybe Camus listeners like are pretty tuned into this idea that, like these power structures like are in place, and like access to natural spaces used to be the domain of working class people or people who worked in the woods or people who were peasants, for example, and lived in nature constantly.
Mm-hmm.
But it's interesting to see over time this as these spaces are valued and as things like forest bathing are actually verified by science that to be incredibly beneficial to us, there's almost like this disturbing inversion in the sense that now these places will be dominated by the wealthy, and the sort of less natural spaces will be sort of the place that the underclass will be, sort of shoved, which is it's a disturbing idea, I think. And I was trying to tap into that in that section, at least.
Yeah. And you also have, as you mentioned, a timber tycoon later on. So and we're going to touch on that
for sure
later in the interview. Though I also wanted to talk about the exploration of trees and the theme of trees and the way we relate to trees, both living and also maybe post-living as timber. And the way that we engage with them in everyday life. It's present throughout the book. And I know you are a carpenter yourself. And I wanted you to speak a bit to the sentimentality that you imbued into woodworking, the affect that is reflected in the trees, and maybe how the prosaic or the poetic communication of that, how you wanted to impart that on the readers.
One of the things that I love most about fiction is that it can kind of hold something up and look at it from a multitude of perspectives at the same time and kind of hold space for all of them being true.
Mm-hmm.
And I really wanted to do that with trees and forests. Like, I think, the book presents many different views of trees and forests as, something that just you cut down and then use as firewood to survive, which is a valid take, I think, on trees and forests. Something to log and turn into housing for people and turn into building material is also a reasonable use and perspective to take. But then also, the more romantic kind of sentimental view of trees being beautiful, and they truly are, or spiritual entities with a deep resonance for human beings, I think. And so and then also their ecological function in, on this planet in terms of carbon capture, in terms of moderating our climate, in terms of making life possible on Earth. So like all of these functions of trees, I think I wanted to get at and to exemplify without kind of signing off on any of them, because I think we really reduce the discussion. I love tree books and I love nature writing, but sometimes when I'm reading it, I kind of get sickened by the like sort of sanctimonious treatment of nature as this holy, beautiful thing, when it's also like, and also like there are people who live in the woods and they're not having like religious experiences every day. You know what I mean? Like it's like, it kind of makes me sick too. Like, and so I think that fiction can do this wonderful job of presenting all of those perspectives and saying like all of these things are true at the same time, and they're all valuable and interesting and something to acknowledge. So I'm for me, fiction is sort of the best way to not answer questions. Do you know what I mean? I like that about it. I think we have too many answers.
And I think and as you mentioned, you have a bunch of different characters who engage with trees differently, thinking about labor. We have, Everett, who has a sugar bush and taps trees, also a carpenter. We have Liam, who's a carpenter, Jacinta, who is engaging with the forest in a tourist way, as well as being a scientist. So another interaction with the trees. We have and as well as Willow, who frequently harvests chanterelles, and I do that as well.
Okay.
And the environment that chanterelles grow in is produced and maintained by these trees
in close concert with them.
So when you were writing the book, were you thinking about all the ways that we economically rely on and engage with trees?
Yeah, I mean, I think it began from my own love of trees and forests, and from a hiking perspective, from a carpentry perspective, from I also like apples, it's just it's almost like a lens that you can just put on, and all of a sudden you start seeing trees everywhere all the time, and that is sort of how I do think. And so the book was sort of a fun exploration of that. But I think it's you can, as I said, you can view them from all these different perspectives at the same time. And I was born in Thunder Bay, Ontario, in a working class kind of situation, and there's a pulp and paper mill there near my grandfather's house, and it stunk, and it was but it also provided a livelihood for people. And I think that one of the things that gets lost even in my own environmental discourse is the fact that we live in relation to nature, and if we only take the perspective of trees are sacred, holy things, anyone who's ever cut one down is evil. Do you know what I mean? We end up alienating a lot of people who rely on this resource for their livelihood. And so I think it's hopefully this book can kind of complicate that a little bit and reach out to folks, and sort of highlight this sort of wonderfulness of trees and forests in many different respects.
And I think two of the characters who clash on that are Willow and her son Liam.
Yes.
Where Willow definitely has this veneration for trees and how they are sacred, and wanting to limit her footprint on the earth in the way that she does not cut down trees. And then on the other hand, you have Liam, who becomes a carpenter, and he also kind of questions his mother's, I think, binary separation of humans and nature.
Yes.
Where Liam's well, I'm a carpenter. I use reclaimed wood to make tables and other things. And is that not nature? Humans are a part of the environment.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, the book we haven't mentioned yet is very much about intergenerational relationships and kind of rebellion, in the sense that your parents do one thing, and then as their, descendant, you just want to do exactly the opposite in a way, which I think is really true of intergenerational relationships a lot of the time. And then also the sense of particularly with Willow, her father was a timber tycoon who decimated large swaths of old growth forest. And so she felt almost like a moral debt to the earth that she needed to atone for. And hence her work and her sort of activism. It's interesting though, because there's a lot, I do a lot of interviews, or I'll do book clubs, and I get a really wide spectrum of people's opinions on books, and Willow in particular, for many readers, is very hard to take because I think she activates the bad mother trope for some people, or they see her as choosing her ideology over her role as a mother, which I don't think she necessarily does, but that's a view of her. but then also her direct action stuff. She actively sabotages logging equipment. She, breaks the law. And some people really take exception to that. And I find it really interesting that some people love her and some people really she's the most loathed character in the book by some, which I find fascinating because I love her.
I do want to hit in on that. I'm thinking about the intergenerational relationships that are here.
Yeah.
Everybody is trying to do the best with what they have with their kin. And, you mentioned Willow lives out of a van and, raises Liam in this van. And she's doing this because she wants to impart on him a certain respect for the world around him and wants him to kind of follow in her footsteps in a way. But I would say that none of the characters really has what we would consider to be a quote unquote normative childhood. Their parents are estranged, they're living on the road, or one of them is absent or fled, so we have these that you don't tell a nuclear family story when you're telling this generational saga.
No. I once did this was during COVID, but I did a writers festival in the Netherlands, and they broadcast my face on this giant screen in front of this audience, and there was an interviewer sitting there, and I was at home in my basement, and the guy was the opening question was Michael Christie, you do not believe in happy families. And I was I guess not. I don't know. It was such a funny thing. But I do think, families are complicated, and we read fiction not to see everything go okay. I mean, we read fiction to have an emotional experience and to connect with people and see our flaws and our dysfunction play out in these lives of these characters. And I, think that their struggles are very relatable. And I think that, there is a level of authorly compassion, I like to think, for everybody in this book. And I, was very careful not to cast someone like Harris Greenwood, who is the timber tycoon, as a mustache twisting villain who is ah ha ha, I'm going to destroy the world's forest, yay, and or to also not cast Willow Greenwood as an infallibly morally clean person who's fighting the good environmental fight, because I think that with all decisions we make, there are costs, and there are costs to living a life of direct political action and living in a van and kind of refusing societal norms in the sort of more extreme way that she did. And I'm not judging her, but I think that I wanted to get at those in the book as well, because that is the most human truth that I could kind of find.
And sticking with Willow, I think a lot of Camus members will see at least some of their politics best reflected in Willow, as you mentioned, doing direct action as well as activism. Even later into Willow's life, she's handing out pamphlets, she's still very much involved, as well as her lifestyle she sees as a political act of living the way she does. We also have some characters earlier in the book, Jake and her colleague Knut, who also are criticizing, the kind of capitalistic system they live in and the way that it exploits the forest. And I was also interested in interested in the other ways that you included politics throughout. So we have the Manchurian crisis and the Imperial Japanese building Manchukuo. Harris Greenwood is selling them was it spars
for their railway,
which eventually causes an international crisis. And we have labor conflicts as well, which Harris is very quick to crack down on. And one thing that I thought would be included that didn't pop up was the War in the Woods, Clayoquot Sound. But I wanted to think about how you thought of including politics in your fiction, because there is a trend in literary fiction to stay away from these kinds of subjects and not to, have this kind of intimate engagement from so many perspectives around these very fraught political issues. Because today, we have Fairy Creek, which has been going on, could be seen as another iteration of the War in the Woods. Yeah. And we also have local controversies like the plans of the city to remove the sequoia in Centennial Park.
Yeah.
So how do you, as an author, think about engaging with that?
Yeah. I mean, it's so hard because I have my political life and my beliefs and my kind of evolution as a person who cares about the world. I mean, I think that it's no accident that, like I spent much of my 20s working in the downtown east side at a homeless shelter for folks struggling with addiction and mental health issues at the same time. So I was very much kind of plugged into the systemic problems, societal problems, like all of them are kind of like evident in that world: racism, classism, sexism, all the things. And so, it was very much a part of my world and still is. But I do, in general, as a fiction writer, try to leave that stuff kind of more intuitive and sort of like work my way through the story and then retrospectively be like, oh yeah, no, this is really very much about labor relations, or this is very much about the exploitation of the land, the displacement of Indigenous people in Canada, the fact that Canada is sort of founded on this like rampant resource extraction, from the fur trade, the fish, the oil, like all through Canada's history, and that its wealth is basically made of this one thing that it's done. So during the writing of the book, though, I didn't think about any of this stuff. I was much more grounded in character, in the struggles of the individuals. One thing that was really fun was to kind of weave truth into the fiction. So Harris Greenwood has this Greenwood Timber Company, which I kind of modeled on H.R. Macmillan's Macmillan Bloedel, which eventually turned into Macmillan Bloedel, and sort of thought like, oh, I'm going to make one of these timber companies and it's going to be like those guys, but it's going to be fictional. And then I kind of introduced real characters like John Rockefeller. It makes an appearance in the book, and some other like sort of real characters kind of turn up. And it's sort of fun to, as a fiction writer, particularly, to kind of weave truth into your created characters to sort of give it a sense of truth, I guess. But yeah, no, I guess to answer your question, I don't really think about it, but I'm very much aware that the stories that I'm interested in telling have political roots and are politically engaged. Although, we may end up talking more about this later, but I've been asked to speak on logging policy at the BC legislature by like political, and I turned it down because I think it's really dangerous territory to get into. And I've talked to other writers who this has kind of happened to become more of a political entity than an artistic entity, because while I have my own beliefs, once you become a football in that game, it's hard to go back. And so I do struggle with engaging with this sort of official political machine.
Yeah.
And I much prefer to remain in the artistic realm and, affect things hopefully that way, emotionally, rather than like institutionally.
Right. But if, a Carpenters Association wanted to invite you to talk about installing skylights, that's something you could do.
100%. I would say never do it because they always leak. That's the thing. Yeah. No, that would be fine. But it's a weird thing to, as an artist, to like be asked to sort of
Mhm.
step into that realm because I, much prefer to operate on the outside and the margins of things rather than sort of the center. Yeah.
Well, I think there's a distinction between like electoralism and government policy and the wider everyday politics that people are engaging in and experiencing, which I think that Greenwood really taps into.
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah. And I think I lack I don't know, the temperament or the like savviness
Mm-hmm.
of like politics. I just would rather not be there. So yeah, that's what I'm doing so far.
Picking up on one of the threads you mentioned about colonialism
Mhm.
and indigenous peoples. So there are no indigenous characters in Greenwood, though you do refer to indigenous nations, indigenous names.
Yep.
You also reference settler colonialism as well as the dispossession of indigenous lands through your book. And, thinking of other Canadian literary fiction, especially those that are on similar award lists like the Scotiabank Giller Prize.
Mhm.
I thought that was unique that you recognize the settler colonialism in Canada and include it in the text. Why was that important for you to engage with?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty hard. I think it would be very difficult for me to write a time spanning novel about one Canadian family and about this kind of resource extraction wealth without like engaging with that fact that stolen land, displacement of peoples, exploitation of resources is kind of the reason that Canada exists. I mean, one of them certainly, but I think a big one. And so it was, how can I put this? You never, as a fiction, especially as like a white fiction writer, you never want to like reach for something that you can't pull off. You never want to speak for people who are just fine speaking for themselves. You never want to do something dumb, basically, in your writing that is tone deaf and clueless. But at the same time, I think it's really interesting. And I think there's work to be done for all of us in terms of like writing about this stuff. And, I certainly grew up in Thunder Bay where like indigenous cultures and racism they experience is like front of mind and is especially lately. And so to not engage with that stuff for me would feel almost sort of strange. Almost like an omission in the text, I think. And so I did that with great care and with a lot of self-reflection and a lot of humility, hopefully, and like humbleness. But I do think that the book benefits from it because I think it's a story about Canada that settler people need to hear and needs to be told. And I think that there's kind of a war for the mythology of Canada being fought. And I like to think that Greenwood pushes things towards the acknowledgement of the exploitation more than it like celebrates these kind of tired Canadian myths that we need to discard.
Yeah. And following up on that, how do you feel that fiction can make a difference? Greenwood waging into the conflict over Canadian mythology and Canada's past.
Yep.
How do you think fiction and art can contribute to shifting, these narratives in broader Canadian society?
This one is tough. And I once read that, Upton Sinclair wrote this book called The Jungle, which was about like labor conditions in the stockyards in Chicago. It's like it's just such a brutal read, and there's so much humanity in it, and it's about like meat production and labor and all this stuff. And I remember reading, like the book was a sensation, but the sensation wasn't the fact that people were outraged at the labor conditions and the conditions of all these immigrant folks who are working in these horrible conditions. it was that in one part he described how sausage was made. And like all the like awful and like stuff scraped off the floor was put into the sausages. And like people were absolutely outraged by this detail in the jungle and much more paid attention to that than, you know, all the other political stuff that he put into the book. So I don't know. I think there's a lesson there in that you know, you may have a political aim for a book and you craft it in a certain way, but you also have to be careful because, you know, fiction by its very nature takes on a meaning that is beyond what you are even able to describe or plan for. And
Mhm.
so, and we've all read, you know, didactic, sort of propagandistic fiction that feels limited, I think is possible. And so I'm careful,
Yeah.
but I do think that to hide from bigger issues like the climate crisis and labor relations and the exploitation of nature and even like addiction is a big theme in the book, is the wrong approach too. And I think so. I like to think that my book is politically affecting,
Mhm.
but I also reserve the right to be like, I don't know in what way, and I'm open to all kinds of interpretations
Mhm.
of the book as well, and I'm not gonna like sign off on anyone. Yeah.
And you have a whole host of labor relations in this book.
Yeah.
You've got striking workers.
Yeah.
You have the cruel conditions of the logging camps, and you have different kinds of loggers as well. You have
Yeah.
those who are paid by the timber companies. You have those who are squatting, who are stealing the lumber.
Yeah.
And in addition to that, you also show the kind of the gig work that the vagrants, the other homeless peoples engage in,
Totally.
and the way that they kind of find work in everyday life. For how did you go about researching and including those parts in the text?
Yeah, I think work is something that's so seldom written about. Like a lot of times I read literary fiction and I'm like, how do these people afford to have these like crises of, you know, existential crises while, you know, their lives don't fall apart? Because for the majority of people that is not possible. So yeah, I love to write about work. I think that it for many of the characters, it is how they engage with the world and how it moderates their experience of the world. And often there's a lot of like, something we haven't mentioned yet is that each time period that I picked is kind of an era of economic calamity. And so like even the 1974 oil crisis is mentioned for Willow. 1934, obviously, the Great Depression, which was a climate crisis, like the Dust Bowl was a climate crisis as well. And so like I love the idea that there were these like echoes through history of these like hard times. I've always been like fascinated by hard times. In the 2008 financial crisis, like Liam actually like loses his house in the financial collapse of that time. And so I don't know, I loved the idea that there are almost like there are these people who are existing in this system that is like fluctuating and destroying people's lives and then coming back, and it's almost like it's very much a book of systems. There's like the natural system, the economic system, the family system, and each time period sort of is those are all interacting with each other. Yeah.
And the Greenwoods seem to be interestingly both constrained and really structured by these systems,
Yeah.
while also bucking them. Like there's this constant movement for these characters between being forced into certain choices or feeling they're forced into certain choices. For example, Jake at the beginning of the book needs to pay off her student loans.
Yes.
So she's working at this job she hates, even though she's surrounded by these beautiful trees. But you know, she still has to do this job, and it's one of the few places that that's available. And she's very anxious about her work and about her livelihood and what she's going to do. And then at other times throughout the story, the characters are able to, escape society or
Yes.
live outside it in some way.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I realized that only later, that there are a lot of characters who are sort of like living on their own or taking off into nature, or like getting in a van. And I think that I've always had sort of a more romantic uh, kind of affinity for that approach, or the kind of like marginal life, living life at the edges for whatever reason. And I think, there's a lot of ironies to be found in that, like Liam Greenwood, who, is this like very skilled carpenter who's going to tear down old barns, for this like distressed vintage wood to bring to the vacation homes of this New York super wealthy to install in their places to make them feel more authentic. Like the layers of irony there are like very, very fun to explore for me. And I think that Jake's work is very emblematic of what it's like to live in like late stage capitalism, where you're like, I have this thing that I love, but I'm also being exploited and I have to watch rich people enjoy it while I'm kind of enjoying it. Like there's just so many layers that I found like resonant to our experience like now, and so that was fun to write about too. Yeah.
And thinking about the economic anxiety that we experience, there's been a lot of discussion about the current generations and home ownership, and the who owns land. And in your book, there are all of these conflicts over land ownership and leasing and property and squatting, the value of land, whether land can be worked. It seems to be like one of those themes like labor that's like ever present through Greenwood that I hardly see discussed in other literary fiction. Was that top of mind as well?
I think so. Yeah, absolutely. There was, certainly, if you look at Canada's colonial history, or if you talk to Indigenous folks about like the importance of land and the theft of land and the resources that can be generated from the land. I mean, that's kind of the whole game. And there's also like very much a theme of inheritance in the book. There's like the inheritance of money, the inheritance of genetic code, there's the inheritance of land, and then also the inheritance of trauma. There's sort of like these traumas that are passed through the family members. And so I think it's really, it's obviously, as a person who lives here on this land, I think about it all the time. Just like, who owns this land really? What does land ownership even really mean? Like the sort of social construct of ownership of anything is bizarre, obviously. And so, yeah, I love that the book could get at that idea and sort of almost like emotionalize it and demonstrate it over time. Because one of the great things I think about fiction is it can span time. Particularly the novel can present like this is like 140 years of human life, and you can kind of have this wonderful overview of how wealth is transmitted and how land is transmitted forward to generations, and how generational wealth works and all of that stuff, which is, you don't really have access to, I think, in your normal everyday life. And these stories can make it emotional and make it experienceable by readers.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your time with us. Do you have anything that you would like to share or say now? This is your moment.
No, I would like to say, I when I first started writing, I lived on Commercial Drive, and I would go to the People's Co-op bookstore all the time. And I think that was like where I first bought some of the first literary fiction that I ever bought. I always got like books used or secondhand. I like bought like that was my first intentional buying of books. And so when I went to Canvas for the first time, I was like, oh, this is like the best, And so I just want to say thank you to you and all the other volunteers there and the folks who run it, because it's such a great resource to have in Victoria. It's essential, and I love it.
Thank you so much, Michael. Michael's book, Greenwood, is available at Canvas Books and Info Shop, located at 2620 Quadra. And we're open every day of the week from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m.
Came back today like you threatened he will. Which poor group of people do you think that he would kill? And who would Jesus choose to starve if you gave him the chance? And if there was a genocide, would he take a neutral stance? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would he say it's complicated and there's sinners on both sides? Or would he say that some people, they just deserve to die? If Jesus Christ rose from the dead and on a sidewalk slept, would you extend your hand to him or just watch where you stepped? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus hate the gay folk, the queer folk, or the trans? Would he suggest they end their lives according to God's plans? Would Jesus tell a homeless man to get a fucking job, or turn his back on the poor? Would Jesus be a snob? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus build a border wall? Would Jesus drive a tank? Would Jesus be a landlord? Would Jesus run a bank? Would Jesus Christ feel safe in his skin if he came to your town? And would you still believe in him if you found out he was brown? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Yeah, who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well,